So the Orky Elite looks like it's now stomping the battlefields flat in the 41st millennium. Let's talk about the Nobz mob and why they're so good right now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Orcs once more, and today I thought we'd do a focus review on one of the strongest units in the new Arcs of Omen meta, the brutal Orky shock elite that is the Nobz squad. Previously to the points updates they were kind of okay, now the main changes that they got from the update were going down in cost, and I think it's changed them from a unit that's kind of usable and decent enough to one that's really quite standout within the Orc Codex. In the video we'll talk over their datasheet, best weapons to equip them with, the things that you can use to get more out of them in game, and a couple of examples of Nobz being run in some strong army lists. Loads to talk about, so let's jump in and talk about these Orky elites. In the lore, the Nobz are basically the biggest and meanest of the Orc boys, Nobz meaning Orc nobles, but of course it is a very funny name as well. The Orky elites often function as a bodyguard for their war bosses, big and strong Orcs who have fought and killed for the best gear, and are pretty much the epitome in greenskin violence with their big choppers and power claws. I'd say that the kit itself is really quite a nice one. It's £21, €27 or $35 from Games Workshop, around about 2.9 points per dollar, which isn't too bad by their standards. And I must admit these ones are probably a positive victim of kit aging. When Games Workshop releases 5 model kits these days, they're very rarely below £30. If you wanted to pick some up, but also bear in mind that they've been discounted in a lot of box sets over the years, you might well be able to find them going cheaper on eBay, or even just use Nobz from boxes of boys that you might not be deploying in your army otherwise. I think the minis are really quite fun ones, a fair bit of customizable options and selections. They don't have ultimate flexibility with every single option in the box, but they've got a whole bunch of big choppers, 3 combi weapons, 3 power claws and a kill saw, plus a few other fun options like a power stabber and an ammo runt. Orcs being orcs though, they are quite fun to kit bash. If you were looking to pick some up, Element Games does sell them in the UK as well. They're a discounter, which I've got a link to down in the video description. They'd be selling them for £17.86, so 15% off at time of recording. If you're in the UK and you're looking to pick them up, that could be at a small discount, and also any purchases through that do help out Auspex Tactics as well, at no extra cost to yourself. Let's talk rules though, and this is the current datasheet for Nobz in Warhammer 40K, 17 points per model, and they're an elite's choice that you can take in squads between 5 and 10. Their stat line's fairly beefy, 5-inch move, hit on 3s in combat and 5s at shooting, strength and toughness 5, 2 wounds, 3 attacks, leadership 7 and a 4+ save, a fair bit of all-around raw might for that points cost I think. I'd say if they're just armed with base sluggers and choppers, they generally compare badly to standard boys who are quite cheap at 8 points now. I'd rather have 2 of those than 1 Nob model. But the big boost that they got in Arcs of Omen was that they got a whole bunch of their gear either completely free or discounted, so it means that every single Nob can pick up a big chopper completely for free now, typically giving their attacks at strength 7, AP -2 and damage 2. I would absolutely do that, and I think it's better than the power stabber or any other combination. Then for 5 points you can either upgrade to a combi weapon or take a power claw or kill saw instead. You can take them on every single model. I'd say the combi weapons are a bit suboptimal to be honest, as they replace your melee weapons. The squad's a lot better at dealing damage in melee than at range, and I feel like the combis are just a bit underwhelming for the cost of the models. The power claw and the kill saw though are both very solid, strength ×2, AP -3 and 4, the power claw's damage 2 and the kill saw's damage D3. I'd only take either one or the other. I probably wouldn't double up on the kill saws, as I don't think that the extra attack is worth another 5 points. And I feel like they're actually kind of balanced versus the big chopper. You could have a big chopper mob that's just nice and cheap, and then upgrade either some or all of them, so you've got some big strength 10 attacks going in to deal with enemy heavies. The power claw and the kill saw I think are at least fairly well balanced. I think between the two I slightly prefer the kill saw myself. The extra AP plus damage D3 are both good things. It will mean that the power claw is a bit more efficient against 2 wound things like Space Marines, but the kill saws will be more efficient against 3 wound models and anything with a very high save or a -1 damage mechanic. Between those lot I think that the kill saw wins out slightly, though there's not a whole load in it. For other equipment, you can then choose the second weapon that you pair either with your big chopper or your power claw. You could take a slugger with that, but to be honest that's kind of weak value with only a 5+ to hit. I would take another chopper in the second hand. That gives you an extra attack at strength 5, AP -1 in combat, and I think that's far more worth it than a strength 4 attack at AP 0 that only hits on a 5. Finally, for every 5 models, the unit can take an ammo runt, which is helpful I guess, a single hit reroll once per game. I guess on paper it could be okay with something like a combi rocket, maybe could incentivize you to take one of those in the unit, but I think in reality I'd just stick with the full melee weapons, it is what they're good at. Overall, fairly scary Orky elites. I'd load up with either big choppers, power claws, or kill saws, and then put them in a transport and throw them at the enemy for some big damage. For weaknesses, I'd say their durability for this cost is okay but not standout. Anything with a bit of AP and 2 damage is going to go through them quickly, like heavy bolters. And of course, Orky leadership has issues. Even if they lose a few casualties, you've got a fairly reasonable chance of failing morale. Looking at their weapon choices, here's just a bit of a damage comparison between the big choppers and the kill saws. And for each of these loadouts, I have included the extra attacks from the regular chopper as well, as I guess that technically gives an advantage to the big chopper squad as they get more models. For this one, we're comparing a 17 point per model big chopper squad with 10 of them to their equal weight for a squad armed with kill saws, which had averaged 7.7 knobs there, and seeing how much they kill for the unit. I would bear in mind that the big chopper squad will be significantly tougher than the kill saw squad, as you basically got an extra 2.3 orcs on the go there, so the enemy has to chew through more bodies to wipe the unit, a plus 29% durability increase. I'd probably argue that the damage is a bit more important than the durability, as often they want to be jumping out of transports and staying safe until they get to strike, but it's certainly not nothing. First up for the big chopper attacks at strength 7, AP 1 and damage 2, that's average you a fairly meaty 18 dead guardsmen, 8 dead space marines, around about 3 dead terminators, 11 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle, but fall down a bit against the hardest targets with only about 4 wounds to a toughness 8 vehicle with -1 damage. Compared with that, the kill saws are a bit worse against the guardsmen because of less accurate attacks. They're about even against standard space marines, but then get significantly better against the heavier targets, around about 4 or 5 terminators, 16 wounds to the toughness 7 vehicle, and much better against the hard target with 7 wounds to a toughness 8, 5 plus invul and -1 damage thing. That would be even better if it didn't have the invul save and the AP could get to work. Compared with power claws for these targets, the power claws will be very slightly better against the standard space marines, but worse against the terminators, vehicle, and the hard targets. I guess power claws might have an edge if there's a bunch of 2 wound or 4 wound targets in the meta, but I feel like the kill saws are generally going to be a bit more general purpose. I would bear in mind other buffs as well. The War or the Goths clan might actually give a small edge to the big choppers. They could become either strength 8 or strength 9 depending on what combo of those buffs that you have going, and that would admittedly catch them up a bit on the Terminators and the vehicle targets. Admittedly, the exploding sixes from Goths does help out the kill saws quite a bit, so it's not all one way. Overall, I genuinely feel that these are pretty well balanced at the moment for the extra 5 points for the saws and claws. I suspect I'd be tempted to take at least a few saws or claws within the unit, perhaps particularly on the boss knob with more attacks, just to give the unit a bit more punch against the hardest targets around. Not too much in it though, I think 4 units of either big choppers or the claws or saws seem absolutely fine as well. Let's talk about a few more ways to get a little bit more out of the Nobz squad then. First up, as well as their actual stat lines, they get the core Orky rules like re-rolling in their charges from Here We Go, always helpful to get into combat, and also they'll enjoy the War as well. A whole clutch of different benefits that really helps them out. The +1 strength and +1 attack is going to be great, advance and charge for a core unit is awesome, and the 5+ invul save will help keep them safe when the enemy counterattacks. If they can be striking in the turn that you call the War, then all well and good. Transports are a bit hit and miss in Warhammer 40k, but I think for Orcs the Battle Wagon is an excellent choice for transporting the Nobz into battle. It's only 105 points base for really quite a lot of ramshackle wounds on the board. It does give you a bit of a battlefield bunker that you should be able to launch a charge out of, and gives them a bit more speed and protection where they need to go. I feel like their low base movement means that they're going to struggle to get into combat, and are likely going to be taking a turn or two's enemy firepower if they just foot slog it, and it just doesn't seem ideal with their low saves and the way that they can be killed by certain damage 2 weapons really quickly. I'd be very tempted to take a battle wagon, maybe thinking about upgrades like either the Ard Case or Death Roller, or just keep the thing absolutely as cheap as possible. The other option for transports are trucks as well. I think that I would generally default to battle wagons as the first choice unless you're actually making use of the Truck Boys Specialist mob. That's the one that you can only take 1 of per detachment, and in Arcs of Omen you only get 1 detachment, so the choices really are quite limited. The way that Truck Boys works is that you give up your clan culture, so you wouldn't get the melee benefits of being Goths for example, but you're able to get out of a truck after it's moved, and then potentially move and charge after that. It means that Truck Boys Nobz just have an absolutely crazy threat range in terms of being able to engage the enemy. The truck moves 12 inches, you can jump out the front an extra 3 inches, then move your normal distance, maybe even advance and charge if it's the turn of the War, and then you've got your charge distance which you can then re-roll. Overall, it adds up to around about an average of 30-inch threat range, which really means that you could throw an entire Nobz squad right into the enemy deployment zone and be getting first turn charges, and that kind of crazy mobility could easily be enough to take the damage output cut of not being Goths, just to try and engage the things that your opponent least wants in combat. Definitely seems very usable to me. Otherwise, orcs have a bunch of buffing characters that could potentially be helpful. There are a lot of things that could potentially target them. I think in reality though, the things that are most practical to use are having a war boss somewhere nearby for his +1 to hit for the unit. It's very good particularly with the power claws and kill saws to counteract that -1 to hit. Otherwise, I'd say the next most usable one is perhaps the Weird Boy for the +1 attack psychic power. That's going to be pretty meaningful if you get, say, 10 extra power claw attacks with that. That's going to be a really big deal. And I guess in theory you could have some use out of the Pain Boy, the War Banner, a custom force field, or being near to Ghazghkull Thraka if you can coordinate that. I feel like the Pain Boy and the War Banner just maybe a little bit expensive for what they bring, and the custom force fields buff isn't enormously helpful if you're running War anyway, as you're going to be getting a good turn of 5+ invul save and then a 6+ with the War just as stock. Jumping out of a battle wagon alongside a boss though seems very easy to do, and a Weird Boy somewhere in the list seems pretty reasonable as well. They're quite efficient with their powers plus maybe jumping other units around the board. For the Orc clans, Goths are by far the most played competitively at the moment. They're kind of hard to pass up for a lot of Orc players, just massive amounts more melee damage with their exploding 6s to hit, and their +1 strength on the charge. Both of those are pretty handy, the exploding 6s particularly good on the power claws, seeing as you only hit on 4s anyway. And as mentioned before, the +1 strength is pretty great on the big choppers, really nice to get them to strength 8, wounding Space Marines on 2s and toughness 7 vehicles on 3s. They also have the stratagem as well to make the exploding 6s go to a 5+ for 2 CP. Nobz might be one of the best targets for that for using it efficiently. Otherwise, I'd say the other more standout clan are probably Death Skulls, objectives secured, rerolls when you shoot and fight, and mortal wound protection are all pretty solid, plus they might be able to make use of wreckers if they're chopping up vehicles in combat. Otherwise, I'd rate the other clans as just a bit more marginal. Snakebites will be a bit more durable against strength 6 or 7 attacks, Evil Sons a little faster, Blood Axes have some cover and some melee flexibility, and the Freebooter's buff for +1 to hit is nice if you trigger it, but just not really reliably done in combat compared with shooting. If you're charging multiple things, your opponent's got a good chance of interrupting somewhere. For stratagems, despite being on paper quite a good unit to target with them, the standard Orc ones I think are just a little bit low yield on the Nobz squad. Perhaps one of the most usable ones is Breaking Heads for 2 CP. That one's a bit of leadership manipulation. If you fail a morale test, then you can deal D3 wounds to a unit within 3 inches of your Nobz to count as passed. It means that if you do get unlucky with a morale test, then you can mitigate the worst of the losses, and this seems like a fairly reasonable one to use on the Nobz squad itself if they do fail morale and you think that a reasonable amount of them are going to run. Still though, a little bit on the painful side at 2 CP. Otherwise, Tide of Muscle could be useful enough to ignore charge modifiers if that's going to be a big deal, charging into dense terrain or certain stratagems. Potentially in the right situation, I guess you could use Grot Shields, though it's probably not the easiest to coordinate, and then just any clan-specific damage dealer stratagems are generally going to be useful and efficient on them. Unbridled Carnage to have the Goth attacks explode on 5s is pretty solid, as is the Death Skulls Wreckers for a +1 to wound against vehicles. So in terms of how I'd field the Nobz squad, I'd be tempted by biggest units of Nobz in transports, either likely the full 10 of them in a truck as truck boys to get the most out of that, zip them across the board and engage something that doesn't want to be in combat from a massive distance away. Otherwise, I'd take either a medium to large squad in a battle wagon. I feel like they're a unit that you probably want to not just take minimum sizes of, just to make sure you've got enough critical mass in melee to actually deal with their targets. Plus, battle wagons have an enormous amount of transport space, so it doesn't really punish you from building big. Within the unit, I'd certainly take a chopper in the one-hand weapon, and then debate between a big chopper power claw and kill saw for the second weapon. As mentioned previously, I think that they're pretty well balanced in terms of what you get for the points. I've seen quite a lot of lists run a bit of a half and half mix. That does seem pretty reasonable to be honest. It means that for the first few casualties you take, you could take the cheaper big choppers if you wanted, and be a little bit of a cheaper unit while still threatening bigger tanks and vehicles. For support options, a War Boss or Weird Boy nearby seems pretty reasonable, but I feel like they'd be kind of fun to run without any character support as well if you didn't feel like it. And for the most part, I wouldn't be too worried about the stratagems, maybe the Goth stratagem or Breaking Heads if it made sense. For a rough game plan, I'd set them up in the transport, ideally hidden behind cover if you can, but you'd have to kind of balance that with actually making sure that they can threaten the enemy. And then when you get to move, try and position that transport so you can threaten a charge out of it with the midfield objectives, if of course the opponent hasn't moved up and given you a charge on something important. If you've got the truck boys on the go, it certainly looks like you'd be able to threaten first turn charges. Sometimes that might well be worth it if you can get in on something good or tie up the enemy in their own deployment zone. I'd certainly make sure that if you're running truck boys though, the truck doesn't get shot first. They're not all that hard to kill. Generally, I'd aim to try and put them in a position to threaten something fairly core in the middle of the army. I feel like their ideal targets are bullying light to medium vehicles or medium to heavy infantry. They seem pretty solid for scrapping for objectives in the middle of the board, and their charge threat could be enough to try and make the enemy back off for a turn or two if they don't think that they can face the amount of damage that they can bring. When charging into the foe, you could think about having the transport soak up Overwatch as well if it's going to be an issue. Some damage profiles could certainly take a big chunk out of the Nobz unit. Here are just a couple of examples of people using Nobz squads in competitive lists that are doing well. Here's one I featured on the channel a little while back, a Goss list by Tom Higginbottom who used it to take 4th at the Bolton War. A good number of Nobz in this one, 2 units of 8 of them, 4 with power claws, 4 with big choppers, with choppers in the other weapon hand. It looks like they'd be riding in a couple of battle wagons, this time with an Ard case, and they do have a war boss and a weird boy in the list, which I don't know whether would ride in the battle wagons with them. It does look like there's enough space for them. There's also a bunch of beast snagger boys that also look like they're hiding in the battle wagons and the truck as well. 3 units of 10 of those. Here's another example from the Nephilim meta of the runner-up at the Las Vegas Open, Sean Naden. This was before the Nobz got their big war gear discount, so the Nobz squads would have been a lot more expensive here, but still managed to make the cut. In this list there's a unit of 5 of them with choppers and power claws. I'd guess they'd be in one of the battle wagons once more, and this time there's a big unit of truck boys, 8 of them with choppers and power claws, and they're in a truck with the squig hide tyres upgrades to give it just a little bit more threat range, not that it isn't kind of ridiculously impressive already. Overall, I would rate Orc Nobz as one of the most competitive Orc units now. They were usable before, and big free war gear discounts has put them to the point where they are genuinely great melee damage dealers. The Orcs kind of are a codex that have plenty of units that fit that kind of role, and here's a short list. Boys and beast snaggers get objectives secured, and their weapons will be better against 1 wound infantry with all those chopper attacks. Storm boys go fast and don't need the transports. Commandos forward deploy, are tougher and cover and don't need the transports. Burner boys are a bit more of a close range threat with a bunch of anti-infantry fire, plus the ability to do some melee with their cut-in flames. Mega Nobz trade out some of the raw damage output numbers of the Nobz for better armor with the 2+ save and 3 wounds, and Squig Hog boys are just fast, reasonably tough and generally threatening, though the cavalry bases can limit their movement a bit, having to go around terrain. Generally compared with the vast majority of these, Nobz will typically deal a bit more melee damage per point. That kind of seems to be their niche to me, and particularly on an infantry platform, though you certainly can say that each of the others does have their own advantages over Nobz, depending on what you want out of the unit. It looks like at least the majority of Orc lists don't tend to spam 3 units of Nobz, though I've seen a couple that do that, but it does look like the majority of top performing army lists right now do seem to make room for at least 1 unit of them, with their big melee damage out of a transport. Overall, looking pretty solid. Kinda nice to see the Orky elites actually living up to their fearsome reputation. They have had quite a long time throughout 8th and 9th edition of being kind of underwhelming and pretty overcosted. Let me know your thoughts on the squad down in the comments below. Would you be tempted to run a unit of them, and what sort of loadout would you give them? If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more like this, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll leave a link to another recent Orky video down in the video description, a tier list of the Orc clans and which ones have been doing best right now. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that link down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.